Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining today. I'm Scott Humphries from Midfix, and I'll be facilitating this panel discussion today. Today's discussion is going to focus on the topic of competency. It's something that's been talked about a lot recently. It's a word that's used often. It's quite often not very well defined and often not very well demonstrated. In this conversation, we're going to look at what's changed since the terrible Grenfell tragedy and how far we've come and how far we've still got to go as an industry. We've got a strong panel lined up here today with professionals from different corners of the construction industry that have first-hand experience and insights into what's working, what's not working, and what good looks like, essentially. And we'll try and keep things practical and to the point. As we go through, we'll also be taking questions on Slido from the audience watching on the live stream. There should be a QR code on the bottom of the screen. And if you can't see it there, you can also go to sli.do and enter the code competency, and you can submit your questions that way. We'll try and get through as many of them as possible. And before we get stuck into the questions, I'm just going to do some quick introductions. So if each of you could just tell the audience who you are and what you do and how your experience connects with this topic that we're talking about today. Joe, could you kick us off?
Yeah, good morning. My name's Joe Lloyd. I work for a company called Pavdeco, predominantly training and assessments, building service engineering, and the nuclear sector as well.
Morning everyone, my name's Carrie Good. I work for Stroma Building Control. We are a registered builder control approver. I've been in the industry now for 10 years and also work with Sheffield Hallam University to devise their building regulations module.
Good morning everybody. I'm David Jones. I'm president of the Institute of Construction Management. I've been in the industry for the best part of nearly 6 decades, and it's an interesting time to be in the industry, and we are very much at the forefront of competence and all what we're doing in the post-Grenfell situation. Thank you.
And my name's Doug Cumming. I'm the head of pre-construction and innovation at Sapphire Balconies. I've been in the industry now for 15 years. Within my role at the moment, we innovate not just the product, but also processes such as QA and the training facilities for the team members.
Good morning, I'm Brian Matthews, owner of Iron Out. I'm a consultant specialising in doors and building hardware. So I spend my time supporting companies in quality assurance, risk mitigation, in relation to competence and compliance with these products.
Good morning everybody, I'm James Allen. I work for a family business, company name is 8Co Consulting. We are glass safety and security risk consultants, and I'm also a fellow at the Institute of Construction Management.
Thanks everyone. Sounds like we've got a great selection of panellists here. Today's conversation is going to focus on 4 key areas. And we've got quite a bit to get through, so we'll try to cover everything that we can, but some of them are quite important topics as well. The first one we're focusing on is about the original failings that were exposed by the Grenfell tragedy, and I'm probably going to come to you on this one first, David. But why has competency risen to the top of the agenda in construction today, and what did the Grenfell tragedy expose that made it unavoidable?
Yes, it's a big subject. We're heading for the 8th anniversary of the tragic fire. You know, prior to that, competence has been with us for the time, since the enactment of the European Directive 92/57 EC. You know, in those days, it's a ill-defined topic, but it's so vital that we understand it. It started off as skills and knowledge, and then experience was added. Then, hey, we considered that behaviour was necessary to look at this. Now it's a criminal offence to take work and be incompetent. So behaviour is very important. We're heading now towards attitudes and mindset. So it's a big subject. We haven't got there yet. There's leadership is one of the biggest problems that I can see in the industry. You know, when Dame Judith Hackett originally, several years ago now, said, don't wait for guidance, you know what to do, just do it. What have we been doing for 3-4 years since the enactment of the Building Safety Act? The industry has been crying out for guidance. Why? We've now got a regulator that it regulates. They're not going to guide. They're going to regulate to competent people to do the job properly. So this is where we are at the moment. It's a very difficult situation. It's culture change. The industry needs to change. The industry isn't changing very well. So we're very much driving that agenda. So hopefully this discussion, we'll all get a bit of information out of this and take competence to the next level. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Some really interesting insights there. Doug, have you got any thoughts on this question?
I think the tragic events of Grenfell were exposed what I think we all knew, really. I think, if we're honest, that there was layers of decision making made by people who weren't competent, and that's something that we need to rebuild the public trust in the industry, and layers of subcontracting compliance and layers of subcontracting decision making, moving design responsibility down the line, and looking at manufacturers and what they're producing and how they're proving themselves as competent are things that we have to do to restore that public trust.
Yeah, that's great. Completely agree. And David mentioned something there which I think is a word that often gets used when we talk about competency, and that's culture. And I think that's probably something that we're going to be talking a bit about today. And something I've heard people say recently is that competency often gets used as another word for compliance. What's your thoughts on that, Joe? Is that in line with the cultural shift we need to see? Or?
I think with the cultural shift, when changing behaviours and cultural shifts, certainly with the workforce, there's an element of time that needs to be taken. I think the last time we've seen something of this magnitude was the legislation for the management regulations in 1999. And what that did is basically we had practices and procedures from the 80s and the 90s. Certainly, they weren't up to standard. Lack of PPE, lack of procedures. But what the management regs did in 99, it actually pushed risk assessment at the forefront. Then we started seeing, coming into the new century, we started seeing certainly some of the tier ones with adopting site inductions, risk assessment, method statements, permits. And we haven't really seen that. And that actually changed the workforce's behaviour. All of a sudden, people are wearing PPE. I mean, me and David probably go back to where, the last time we've seen a cultural change from legislation on a national level was 83. And what happened then? Well, we'd all been working, in our cars and vans, and overnight it was a criminal offence not to wear a seatbelt. And it took time for that culture to change.
Yeah.
And I think the key to that change in culture is the implementation and the monitoring. Education needs to be at the forefront.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. Brian, have you got any thoughts on this topic of culture shift?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to culture shift, we're seeing it as almost something that's separate to competence. However, the way that I view it is that part of culture is a change of beliefs and values.
Yeah.
And if somebody is seeing competence as something that they just have to do, another box to tick, that doesn't demonstrate full competence, because the cultural shift is the change in beliefs and values, so that's also links into behaviours. So in order to be competent, you need those sort of behaviours and those attitudes and that mindset to be able to see the value in the cultural shift and in the behaviours and the benefits of doing things well and with respect and ethics and moral values. They have an actual payoff on the project and the value that we bring to communities and the safety that we bring to people. There are so many, so understanding how that actually pays off and benefits everyone is part of competence, and cultural shift is tied into that, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned beliefs and values there, and that often impacts our decision making.
Yeah.
And something that I've noticed people say on the topic of competency recently is that procurement decisions often get driven by cost over competency, despite the lessons from Grenfell. Doug, have you got any comments on that?
I think we're unfortunately still seeing it, that we are seeing packages placed on price, not proof.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's the mindset shift that has to change. We can't look at competency backwards.
Mhm.
Once that contract's been awarded, looking to backfill competency statements just isn't good enough. Competencies should be seen as an investment. If someone's £100,000 cheaper than another contractor, then if they haven't got the QA processes, the product traceability, the qualified installers, if they haven't got that in place, we could be looking at huge remediation costs in the future or rectifying that. And I think we're still seeing cost-driven procurement, not value-driven. And people need to see the value in competence and look at that and assess that as part of the procurement process. And I think that's part of that responsibility that the industry have when they're making those decisions, that they're just as big decisions as specifying a product, as specifying a competent installer, a competent manufacturer that can deliver that project safely.
Correct, yeah. Is this something you'd have seen, Bryony, at all?
Yeah, I think we're all seeing it. Certainly the people that I'm interacting with on a daily basis and networking with, we're seeing these pressures. And I think that many organisations, we see it in politics, we see it in the economy, there's pressure to deliver outcomes. And that pressure to, whether that is moving something off of your desk onto someone else's and just moving it along to the next stage, whether that is a particular outcome or KPI or quota that you're trying to hit, that creates this sort of pressure. And it's almost this sort of false economy of, oh, we're moving forward, we've got traction, because you can get on with something else while this problem that people don't know what to do with is still there. So it does create pressures to make decisions, and a lot of that is around cost and procurement and how we manage projects. I think to pick up on some of your comments as well, quality assurance, management processes, all of those things need to be in place beforehand, and they need to be so familiar that it's easy to operate in that manner. But looking back retrospectively is not as easy to do, and often we find that the cost is still there at the end, whether that's in fines, risks, non-compliance, not completing on time. So I think time-wise it feels really uncomfortable to slow down at the front and make that delay visible, and it's really uncomfortable. But what it does is it reduces the cost later on, it reduces delays later on. So it's about being comfortable with having those processes in place.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's a great point you make there about the pressures that can impact it, and these can be financial pressures, but there can also be things like political pressures, housing targets and things like that, and these are all competing motivations that we have to, that the industry has to deal with, and they don't always work hand in hand, do they, unfortunately. So, yeah, I guess we could say, there's probably some systemic failures that continue to happen, unfortunately, and I'd be interested to get the panel's thoughts on how we can avoid repeating these in the light of what Grenfell has revealed. Carrie, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yep, so following Grenfell, there has been a radical change in the building regulations. So one of those changes was the introduction of Regulation 2A. So this is fundamentally about competency. So there are new 3 duty holders introduced. So we have a client, who's obviously the person who owns and manages the building. Principal designer, who will be the person who's responsible for planning, managing and design, coordinating the design phase, and the principal contractor, who will be plan, managing and monitoring the construction phase. So those duty holders have been set out. Unfortunately, it would have been useful if they had been given slightly different names to CDM, because there has been a little bit of confusion about whether it can be the same person or whether the role is completely different, but that's by the by. There are duties that they have. So, for example, at the end of a project, they have to complete their 2A declaration, which says that they have complied with Regulation 2A, i.e. they have planned, managed, and monitored their stage. This is probably an unpopular opinion, but I don't believe that those people doing those roles should necessarily be consultants, because they are not necessarily the ones who will be responsible for the full planning and managing and monitoring of those relevant phases. However, the regulation itself says should rather than must, which is obviously a bit of a grey area, which is obviously why we do have consultants. Again, not belittling the role of consultants, because obviously there are skill gaps with existing designers and contractors in terms of where regulatory compliance is required. But again, I think that's something that building control have created, because we have been over helpful historically, getting involved in design work when we shouldn't have, we never should have, and we definitely can't now, which has been a bit of a tough pill to swallow for the industry.
Yeah.
But I think the duty holders getting a proper grasp of what their fundamental requirements are would be the first step to making sure that we aren't going to be taking any steps backwards in terms of competence.
Yeah, fantastic. Some really interesting points there. James, have you got any thoughts and comments on this?
Yeah, I think we've got to, right from the very beginning, if you talk about accountability, responsibility, and the whole part of with the training aspect, I think what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that this is going to be another sort of, using Carrie's words, a bit of a tough sort of message to get across. But we've got to make sure that we've got the right people at the right stages at the right time. And just because somebody says, oh, there's a ticker box, I'm competent on this, on that, ideally, the right people, we still have in the industry silo individuals and silo organisations. And so by getting the right people at the right time at the right place, we've got to get them through the front door, we've got to get them all at the table, but all at the same time. Because there's no point in having this bit there, that bit there, 3 weeks down the line, you then got another bit, somebody else comes in. This is all about joined up thinking. It's all about having everything all in line and repeatability. The idea as well is obviously because of, for coordination, yeah, we've got the digitalisation side of the construction industry. So the things like the golden thread, and then looking at that bit side of it, that should help with the with bringing through the right information at the right time, so that everybody's got all the right thing, and that will then help with the training aspect of it as well. And on accountability as well, things have got to be laid out with clear information and clear ideas of where everybody is, what everybody needs to be doing, and that sort of side of thing. And that again, I think, sort of follows a little bit into this idea of leadership and trust.
Yeah.
Because if you've got the right leadership at the very beginning, okay, then everybody else will then know exactly where they are, what they're doing. Then there aren't any issues. All right, issues are always going to come up. But if you've got that trust element and you've got that leadership from at the very top, and you've got other leaders throughout the groups and whatever, then it all makes things work a lot more more relaxed atmosphere. So from that point of view, then it should be able to go a little bit more smoother than if you've got people in there who just kind of wing it and just hope I'll get through to the end. So I think that's from that aspect that, yeah, I hope that's all right.
Yeah, no, that's good. And it kind of links on with one of the things that we heard from Dame Judith Hackett, where she spoke about leadership and empowerment.
Yeah.
And she also went on to tell the industry to work it out amongst yourselves. So I'm going to come to Brian on this one, if that's okay. How do you think that links with competency?
I think there's a really strong link here. So I had the opportunity to see this sort of firsthand in my sector in relation to doors. So I was able to visit FDM Training and Development, so they're a training centre in relation to doors, when Dame Judith Hackett went to visit the centre to see an example of what leadership looks like. And her commentary, you know, to the sector and wider construction was, this is an example of excellence and inspirational, and really calling to see more of that. So what they did was they stepped into the space and saw some gaps and looked to address it. And you know, that by doing that, they were able to empower, you know, professionals to be able to go and get training and benchmark to a standard and a level to demonstrate their competence. So we see this in two different ways. We've got the leadership and benchmarking that sort of James was just touching on there, and examples that we're seeing in whether that's trade associations or new training centres like one I've just mentioned. But we also then have the other side of it of, they can only do so much. We need this, like touching on the points earlier, individuals, professionals, organisations to have those values, to be able to say, I'm taking personal responsibility and accountability, as you said, James, you know, to actually take up the frameworks, the guidance, the opportunities that are available, and for that to become the norm, the new norm.
Yeah.
and invest in training and development. So yeah, I think the overall leadership is twofold, both by organisations setting examples and individual leadership and accountability.
Yeah. So that's working out amongst yourselves can be interpreted as working together more joined up thinking, more collaboration, as we've spoken about. So we've spoken quite a bit there about the sort of the failings that were exposed by Grenfell and how competency came about in the new regulations. And I think if we just move on to the next section, which is about defining competency in the post-Grenfell era that we're in now. As most would probably know, we had the Building Safety Act in 2022, which then went on to update the building regulations, which is known as, we've had it mentioned already, but Part 2A, and 11F defines it as skills, knowledge and experience behaviours. That's 11F of Part 2A of the building regulations, otherwise known as SCEB, as it's often referred to in the industry. So these four words, they can be quite defining, but they can also be confusing as well. And I'm wondering if Joe, perhaps you could help us how we should interpret these four words.
Yeah. Well, we've seen them before. I mean, what you just said there about 11F Part 2A. Originally, they're in, if like, you can go back as far as the CDM, where we see skills, knowledge, experience and training when it's first looked at. I think what people have got to realise is these aren't just best practice now, and it's not just some sort of strap line. It's a legal requirement. You must have skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours. I think the failure of before was the implementation. I mean, if you take the HSE's L153, item 163, it specifically says that sole reliance should not be placed on industry certificates or cards, and MVQs and SVQs should be the foundation of competence. And it actually says there as well that if people haven't got a qualification, they should be assessed in the workplace, in particular when new legislation comes. So my point there is the CDM actually had everything in place.
Yeah.
What we didn't do was implement what was in the CDM in the L153, and ultimately it's taken a terrible accident and then new laws and new legislation. The key to that is, for me, is the implementation of that. Just to pick up what was said there, about companies making sort of like training programs and whatnot. You have to ask, where's the sector skills councils? The sector skills council's remit is to make sure that the sector has enough standards, enough apprenticeships, and the provision to implement those standards. And we're not seeing that. We're seeing companies step forward and, if you like, try and plug a gap. But there needs to be more collaboration from the top. But yeah, SCED, or SCET, as it could be called, isn't it? Skills, knowledge, experience, and training. So we have seen it before, but we need to implement it, and it needs to be monitored.
Yeah, that's great. And whether we like it or not, that is the definition that we have, and that's what we've got to work with, because it's
we can all have an
written into
opinion
law.
of what we think about inheritance tax. The simple fact is, competence is defined by law.
Yep.
It's now all of us about meeting that law.
Yeah.
And I understand the grey area of, where's the skills and knowledge? Where is the definition? And I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Carrie, have you got some thoughts on this full-word definition that we have?
Yeah, so as Joe previously touched on, skills and knowledge and experience and behaviours is the new SCET. Previously, we would have based people's competence purely on qualifications. So back in the 90s, early 2000s, just picking my eras because obviously that's when I was relevant. We would be looking at CVs based on what qualifications you've got, what courses you've done, and what experience you have in your background. And you probably wouldn't look too far around that. So looking forward, we are looking more at things like behaviours and leadership skills, which I think is really valuable, because you may not have the polished person going into a role, but if they have the right attitude and they are looking for the right things, then that would make them an invaluable person, in my opinion, that they can get that competency. They have got the right mentality to be competent. So the word competency isn't about putting a glass ceiling in there for me. It's about making sure that we have the right people in the right place and they're being supported to fulfill what they need to fulfill. And that will touch on industry competence and company competence, which I'm sure is something we'll touch on later.
Sure.
So just making sure that these people who are not necessarily have the right qualifications or the right experience, but they've got the behaviours and the leadership to get them into that position, that their companies will be supporting them into those positions. And obviously, if there's any point that they aren't competent, so for example, if there's a change in legislation, a change in standard, or any other reason they might not be, that they are being able to be supported with their company to reach that level that they're required to be at.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah, that's good. So, yeah, as we said, we've got this legal definition, and there's multiple ways, I guess, of interpreting that, but just trying to make it as practical as possible for those listening. I'm going to probably come to you on this one, James. In the real world construction environment, what do we actually mean by competence?
I think it's actually, from listening to what Carrie and Joe have said, and I think we've all sort of got our own ideas of what competence is at different levels. And when we're actually looking at it from an industry-wide point of view, I think we've got all these things now where we've got competency frameworks that are being done by different organisations, from professionals who've been in the industry for a long time. And I think that there was actually a bit of a mistake made right at the very beginning of when just after the actual fire happened, and Judith Hackett brought out her report, and a certain individual who I won't name put out a remit to basically say to everybody, this is what competency is, but you've now got a free-for-all to now go and sort out your own benchmark levels of what you think competency is. So that was saying to everybody, off you go, then just do whatever you want. That is not, and we come back to this word again, that is not leadership.
Yeah.
That's just basically, that's literally doing the complete opposite, okay? And when you come to competency and defining it for different aspects, we are so lacking leaders and leadership throughout the industry, not just one leader, not just one at the BSR or anybody else from the CLC, CIC or anybody like that. We are short so many places of individual leaders and organisational leaders to then help to raise that level up to the required level. But when you're talking about competency again, in terms of individual and organisational, it's not a case of you've just got to creep over that lower threshold, literally like you do with building regs. Oh, you've gone over that bottom run, that's it.
Yeah.
You've got a massive jump then between the bottom run to the top run, and if you've got to be honest with yourselves, you've got to be aiming up to that top level. Keep striving through to always better yourself. Put your hand up when you think that you're not too sure about something, to gain that extra knowledge, and there's the extra behaviour to put in there, and your attitude, your ethics, to go, yeah, I need extra help here. Put a hand up, but we haven't got that right attitude and behaviour and the right mindset, which again could help with leaders within the construction industry. Yeah. And people are out there to go, here you go guys, and girls, this is what we need to be doing.
Yeah, great point that you made on leadership, and I think this really comes back to what we were talking about earlier about behaviours, doesn't it? And it's about actually being in it for the right reasons, not just because it's in law. Which really links on with the next point I wanted to talk about, because skills and knowledge that we've spoken about, they're probably the most measurable of the SCEB. So experience and behaviour, they could be seen as a little bit more subjective, I guess. Are these something we can standardise, Joe, or what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think just to pick up on what James said there about competency, whenever you think about competence or whenever you hear the word competency, competence is about judgments. For you to be classed as competent, someone needs to make a judgment, and that judgment needs to be against approved standards, set criteria, and you need to have the authority to make that judgment. Think of your driving test. What makes you competent to drive a car? At some point you demonstrated your performance, and someone made a judgment, and you demonstrated your knowledge. Now what sometimes people get a bit mixed up with is they think they have the engineering ability to do a task, but don't really think about whether they've got the legal compliance. I have the ability to replace your boiler and rewire your house from an engineering point of view. That doesn't mean I would stand in a court of law and legal. So you've got to remember that there's a difference between having the engineering capability and actually the legal capacity. If someone drove a vehicle, they could be very competent. They don't have a driving licence, they committed a criminal act. As for the sort of behavioural, We've already got within some of the national occupational standards for construction and building services engineering, we've got criteria in there for working relationships and communication, you know, which is beneficial. What we have in the BSI 8670, which is a few years old, in table 1, what we have got in there now, and we've been told to embed it within all qualifications and even our site practices. We've got criteria that talks about ethics, talks about, if you like, the law of you know, the environment, safekeeping, honesty, integrity. It won't be difficult in teaching that. The difficulty will be assessing the sufficiency of it. I mean, I know part of the main behaviours is definitely making sure people understand the limits of their competence. And what, you know, just because you do a, you know, sort of like a first aid for 2 days doesn't mean you're going to go and do a, you know, a open heart surgery on a Monday. And also reporting procedures and understanding fire safety. So the behaviours, I can see that'll be okay in delivering it. But the competence is about judgments. You know, the golden thread is all about accountability and judgment processes.
Yeah, that's great. So we don't have to see it as an open-ended definition, do we? There is guidance out there on it, and there's some great insights there. Something else that's been talked about quite a bit recently is Gateway 2, and I know there's lots of frustrations and noise about that in the industry about Gateway 2. And one of the comments that somebody put forward was about defining competency at Gateway 2, demonstrating competency at Gateway 2. I wonder if you had any thoughts on this, Doug?
I think we're in a position that we have to demonstrate competency, and that should be more, as Carrie mentioned, more than CVs and, you know, generic CPDs. I think the responsibility for companies to move on to NVQ-based assessments that are a specific criteria is really important. I think people need to be assessed on project-specific ability, and also demonstrate ongoing competence, because will that same person whose CV's been submitted at Gateway 2 still be involved later on down in the project?
Sure.
So I think, you know, companies that embrace that and can show competency through things like the NVQ systems are important. I think companies that adopt their product with a QA system that can be audited by someone who doesn't have to be an expert. So a main contractor might be walking around there to QA, you know, a fire break installation. That having that product be something simple enough that someone can QA it who's not an expert, I think is another layer of that competency for Gateway 2 that should be demonstrated as part of that. And I think they're the types of assessments that we're moving towards, and that type of product design we're moving towards. And I think it's the right direction, more than just say CVs.
Sure, No, that's great. Some really helpful insights there. And another topic that often comes up when we talk about competency is cards and CSCS cards, which tends to be quite a big topic at times. I guess the question is here: do they still have a role, or is the industry relying on them for the wrong reasons? Perhaps, Joe, do you have any thoughts on this?
I've got lots of thoughts on this. I think that the first couple of points that should be made with the CSCS is the CSCS card is not a legal requirement. However, competence or working towards competency is a legal requirement. I think there's 2.2, 2.3 CSCS cards in the industry. You're talking with the health and safety test between £40 to £100, let's say £70. You're talking £150 million over 60 months, which works out £2.5 million a month. I'll leave that hanging there for a minute. I think the challenge for all qualifications, all CPD, all courses, all third-party certification is they are all part of the process of a judgment, and all of those judgments have to link back to item 35 of the Building Safety Act, because they are trying to be part of a process of judgment. So the CSCS card is trying to be part of a process of making a judgment of individual competence, and if you produce a certain qualification, you'll get a certain type of card. But all of those products that I've just mentioned, qualifications, courses, CPDs, they all have to link back to item 35 of the Building Safety Act. Otherwise, somewhere along the line, you're going to put people in legal jeopardy. And the problem with the CSCS is you can get a CSCS card and you've never been to the workplace.
Yeah.
Now that is to me, is a risk. We've got 600,000 people with a green card in our industry. That's 600,000 people who've got no qualifications, who've got no standards, and we have to remember that there are health and safety standards with skills in.
Yeah.
Doing a touchscreen test does not cover the skills. Just because I do the theory for the DVLA doesn't mean I can drive a car. And by the way, just because I go karting at the weekend doesn't mean I get a driving licence. So there is clear standards for judgment. So the problem with the CSCS, I feel now, and going back to the CDN, is they need now to address the skills, what that card is. I mean, I do a lot of work in the petrochemical and nuclear industry, and I know it's 30 years for a skill card this year. At the same time, 30 years ago, they brought an ACE card out in sector, and you had to have an MVQ level 3, and they upskilled all that workforce, and they all went to level 3. I cannot see how the CSCS can't basically upskill and give the health and safety standard to all those 600,000 people. You're going to have to do something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think what a lot of us have seen, and there's been many commenting on this on social media and the likes, is that it tends to drive a bit of a tick box mentality for demonstrating competence.
And that tick box now will come under the legal framework. I mean, if you look at the CSCS website where it says to be a labourer, and it says a labourer can dig a trench, it can mix mortar, it can pour concrete, all those, and I did a presentation the other month actually, David was there, all those activities have defined skills and knowledge. So you can't say someone's going to dig a trench and then miss out the occupational standards for skills and knowledge. The law says you've got to have the skills and knowledge, but the CSCS card says no, just do knowledge. What's the purpose of this? What's the purpose of the health and safety tip? What is the purpose? You're making a judgment. You can't just make a judgment of knowledge because the law says you've got the skills, and industry has defined the skills and the health and safety standards. Construction 641, 642, building service engineering, BSc, BSc 01.
Yeah. And we quite often see it where sites will just mandate CSCS cards across the board. And yes, it might help towards demonstrating competency, but it's not a demonstration of competency ultimately, or absolutely, is it? And reluctantly, I think the CSCS have admitted this, but I guess where the confusion lies is there's no active communication to the industry to make that clear from them, which I think contributes towards the confusion, unfortunately.
Well, look, the health and safety standards for both construction and building service engineering, if you look at the CSCS, both those health and safety standards are regulated at level 3.
Yeah.
So don't tell me they're not skilled. Those health and safety standards, the Sector Skills Council developed. It's the implementation that will be the challenge for them. I mean, there's a few outs, and I've got a few ideas, there's a few outs. But we need to change, and I feel for the project managers who someone turns up with a certain type of CSCS card and it's putting them in a bit of jeopardy. It's not easy to look at a CV, look at working practices, and look at the law and see gaps.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's not easy, and people need support for that.
Yeah, it's a very big topic, and I think it's something we could probably talk about for quite a while.
Well, we can go upstairs and chat, couldn't we?
but no, I really appreciate your insights on that. But I just want to keep the conversation moving here. So the next point, section 3, that we want to cover off is about the progress made since 2017. Obviously, we've talked about a lot that's happened, a lot of the changes that we've seen from a regulatory point of view. So, Brian, I wonder if you could touch on this. What real progress have we seen in improving competency standards in the industry since 2017?
I think it's a really big topic. So to try and keep it quite neat and tidy, we've touched on some of the points today. So to summarise, we've had legislative change.
Yep.
We've had the introduction of new regulation and working groups, multiple competency working groups, who are then working to help us with the leadership and the empowerment to get definitions. What does good look like? What is competence, and how does that work in roles that otherwise perhaps haven't had definitions? I think all of those things happening has also, progression-wise, increased awareness.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have envisioned at the start of my career that something like this would be happening right now. So conversations around the awareness of competence and how we're working on a day-to-day basis. So I think progression-wise, we've seen development in those areas of standards and being able to give us at least a starting point. You know,
Yeah.
it's still very much in development, and there's a lot that you could go and research if you wanted to see what these groups are up to. It's available online if you want to check out what the ICC are doing, what the ICSG are doing. We've seen development of new initiatives as well. For example, the CCPI, Code for Construction Product
Yeah.
Information, is a new initiative to support on the manufacturer side in terms of clear, unambiguous information for products. So yeah, progression, it has been the development, the
Yeah.
start of development of new things, and definitely the awareness. And I think we're right in the thick of it right now.
Yeah, good. That's really helpful. Carrie, what progress have you seen since 2017?
Well, dialectically speaking, you may or may not be aware that there has been a competency standard for building control, both the companies and the individuals. So we all had to go through competency assessments, and we think we were set 12 months to get this done. Doug, you touched on project-specific competence. This is a very good example of that. I have also seen it challenged quite a lot, saying that it was very rushed and then there's no evidence that building control are competent. I would urge you to have a look at the routes. There were 3 different routes, and it is very project-specific. So, for example, the route I took, I had to produce a 150-page portfolio based on projects I've worked on, so that I could evidence that I have the skills, experience, knowledge and behaviours to be able to work on those projects. And I had to submit that, and then I had to go through an interview as well. So we have done that as an industry. It was a lot of hard work, and it's the reason why I've now got to wear hair dye. Thank you very much. I hope it's looking really nice in the light. But that is one change that we have seen. What I would like to see is for this to happen to the rest of the industry. Not because I want everyone to have hair dye, because that's just cruel and unusual, but I think it was a very good way of demonstrating project-specific competence, which I think is what we need, rather than just, you've got an MVQ in this, or I've seen you've worked for 15 years doing this certain part. Doing the project-specific competency assessment shows that you have the skills to work on particular projects. Because we should no longer be picking people because, I don't know, James, I've worked with you on 10 projects, therefore I think you're sufficient to work with me on this really complex 18-metre story office building. No, I need to check that actually you are competent to work on that, and that shouldn't be offensive for me to do that. We should be doing that, and that is the client's responsibility. That is something that I think needs to be made more aware of in the industry, especially with the smaller clients who may not have lots of multiple projects rolling around. They may not understand that is their responsibility, that is their sole responsibility under Regulation 2A, to check the competence of their duty holders underneath them. And that is what we need to do, but it's been set out, it just needs embedding and enforcing.
Sure, that's great. There's some really positive stuff there. And I think, you know, when we talk about competency, it's quite easy to be critical, and oftentimes, rightly so, that constructive criticism is necessary. But there is also some great stuff happening, and there is, you know, that's a great example of how industry is reacting to the regulatory requirements, and it's brilliant to see that kind of thing happening. There is also much more that can be done in the industry, and there is great things happening further down the construction supply chain. You know, different organisations, be it consultants, tier 1 contractors, subcontractors, all the way down to the manufacturers. And you know, really just as an example, that we can demonstrate here, there is, you know, a number of organisations doing some great things, and you know, just to put it forward as an example, some of the things we're doing at Midfix, not to make it a shameless plug, but more as an example, you know, developing things like evidence-based systems, so to drive traceability through sub-assemblies and product systems. So people can competently demonstrate that what they're installing, you know, is fit for purpose. Providing knowledge-based training, so to help people understand the why behind the compliance. Another thing we're working on is the developing a full qualification to address the specific competency gap that isn't covered at the minute through the existing routes. I think, Doug, you've probably got some examples here as well. I think Sapphire doing some great work in this area.
Yeah, I think we've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort developing a QA system for the balcony manufacturer, and hopefully others follow this, but as an example of something that I've been directly involved with, you can use a CE or UKCA certified fabricator for your stubs, you know, mild steel stubs that hang a balcony on a wall. There's a requirement within that to check the competency of the welder, assessing 10% of their stubs. But what Sapphire do is they actually have an AI system within the passport that looks at the photographs to spot any missing welds.
Yeah.
And a step further than that, we still have a team of humans that look at those photos, each and every photo, to see if we've missed if any welds have been missed. And that's in that QA system. But that also goes on to specific training for the people manufacturing the balconies on the shop floor.
Yeah.
They have to go through the Coach Academy, they have to pass that assessment before they're able to make our balconies and QA them. And then when the balconies are installed, have an approved installer program, again installed. And everything I've just mentioned is part of a digital process. There's a record there of where every bit of material came from for that, and also who's manufactured it and who's installed it. And that's the way we interpreted traceability and proving competence.
Yeah.
And being able to have a specific golden thread for the balconies, and that's something we're working towards.
Yeah.
Actually, I can talk about our example, but I know we're not the only one. I know there are others who, in the construction industry, are following suit with that type of process.
Yeah, that's great to see some fantastic work happening there, and that's a fantastic example of you know, from the top to bottom of the construction supply chain, how different organisations can actually step up and try and be a leader in this. We spoke about leadership earlier, and you know, we don't have to wait to be told. We were told to work it out amongst yourselves. These are examples of how we can do that. So it's great to see, and you know, the more of that we can see happening, the better. Manufacturers, the more of that kind of thing that they do, actually the easier they make it for their customers and their customers. So it's, you know, this is the leadership and working together, joined up thinking, and I think we need more of that. Something else, a question that's come up here, and we've touched on sort of certificates and things like that. There's often a gap between someone having a certificate and actually being capable on site, and I guess the question here really is how do we bridge that gap? Have you got any thoughts on that, Doug?
I think certificates are a baseline, but not the full picture. Certificates often come with specific testing scenarios that may not be project specific, and that's something of we need a competent person to assess the certificates. We need a competent person to assess that this is a system that is relevant to this particular building. I think there's also sometimes an abuse of the certificate logo, for example, there. I think we should be, as an industry, diving into those tests, and I think it's great to have that third-party assessment, but it should be, again, looking at, are these system tests, is this relevant to my project, and is that decision of, is it relevant to my project, being made by a competent person? I think that's the criteria we need to look at and make sure that these are.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, go for it, Joe. Yeah.
I think just alluding what Doug said there about what you've got to do is see the difference in an assessment on a system and an assessment on a person. Now, at some point, any system, any component needs to have a judgment that's gone into a design specification. But a competence person scheme, the judgment should be on the person installing the system or installing the component. And a good example would be an MOT. At some point, an MOT has to happen that the component meets a specification. But the MOT tells me nothing about the competence of the driver. So when it comes to competence, start to separate something that's produced, manufactured, has to meet a certain specification, yes. But that is a different judgment process to actually being
totally
installed. And sometimes that seems to be a grey area with people, in particular competence person schemes. Competence person scheme, no one should be in your office. The hazard is not in your filing cabinet, the hazard is on that scaffold. So it's understanding, what am I judging? What am I judging against criteria? Because there is, you know, for instance, the HV 06, that fan code unit, there's a national business standards for judging that system, but there's a national business standards for judging the person who's judging that system. And that's, like what we said before, it's that different sort of understanding. You know, I might have a driving license. It doesn't give me any authority to give my daughter a driving license. It's a different process.
Yeah.
It's that thing about what I think what we're saying before a bit about a couple of times of who's actually judging the judge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just because, like you say, you have that component or that construction product certificate with a BRE, BBA, whatever LABC logo on that certificate,
Yeah.
that's all, oh yeah, that's all right, done. But apart from that, then you go, but how good that person that's actually checking that certificate, do they know exactly what they're checking to
Yeah.
look for? And then that again is a bit more of a,
Well, people wouldn't realise there's actually a SCED for the SCED. So that standard
it's a
exists.
good way of putting
So
it.
the skills and knowledge to judge skills and knowledge exists. You know, most people in learning development understand that skills and knowledge. Actually, what's in the learning development standards is quite good. LD's 10 is the skills and knowledge for the reflection of your own practices. Now, it is more in the learning development standards, but we actually give that to our clients to say, look, when you're reflecting on your own practices, on the improvements, where to look for.
One of the things on the certification, I was really surprised to find that things like BBA certification, once you've got your draft certificate, they send it to the manufacturer to say, would you like to make any changes? Would you like to edit this? Would you like to add any extra details in, for example? And the manufacturer then gets the chance to add images, details into that certificate that may not have been tested.
Yeah.
Whereas something like, for example, a Warrington fire certification,
Yeah.
you can't edit that. That is strict. It was tested in this scenario, and these were the results. And if you're working outside of that scenario, it's not covered by the certificate, but you've got a fire engineer who can make an engineering judgment, and that's being judged by a competent person of saying, I know the performance of this product, but I'm a qualified person to say that's how it's going to perform on my building in my scenario.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thanks for those insights. Some really helpful points there, and I think that'll be really valuable to the audience. Just want to remind the audience at this point that for those that maybe didn't hear at the beginning, we're taking questions on Slido, so if you have got any questions, there should be a QR code on the bottom of the screen. Otherwise, head to sli.do and put in the code competency, and you can submit your questions that way. We have had a couple of questions that have come in, and I think there's one here. We've probably touched on some of this already, but I think it links with this point we've been talking about, the progress being made since. So its subject is frameworks and legislation beyond documents and compliance checks. So the question is, what real practical changes are we seeing on the ground? Are behaviours and decision making truly shifting, or are we still in danger of a tick box culture? So, we're seeing these kind of words come up again. What are we actually seeing on the ground? Behaviours, tick box culture. David, you got any thoughts on that?
I could go on. I'm not. Yes. Since the early days that I've been dealing with certification, we started off in 2007 when I was with local authority. I was senior manager, and we launched the first ever online training for local authorities, because local authorities traditionally are not aligned to professional bodies. Because the local authorities don't pay the fees. So largely the thousands of local authority in-house across the UK have basically gone through their college, they've done their BTECs and their HNDs, ONCs and things like that. But I had incredibly experienced teams that I managed. Last one was Bromley, about 40 in the team there. Architects, engineers, M&E, surveyors, damp guys, drainage guys, whatever. We were doing capital works and plan maintenance. So we needed to actually evidence, one of the things that's come out of this is that the progression is understanding. So the clients, the appointing clients have got to understand who they're appointing. So you need that evidence-based certification and the evidence.
Well, that's a really great point, because it links with one of the other questions that's come in here, which I think puts it really well. What would be a good question for a main contractor to ask a specialist subcontractor to establish behavioural competency? Got any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah. Well, actually, there's a legal requirement to make the client aware of their duties under Part 2A. The hazard is not necessarily in the working practices. The hazard is in the tick box that they've signed. we could all go and do an audit now on a delivery organisation out there, and we've got names, dates, times, documentation, and locations, and then we realise no one has a driving licence. So the hazard actually is in the documentation, which building control have been asked to go and look at. I think just going back to the original question, have we seen changes? I think the tier 1s and tier 2s are driving change because there's legislation driving them. I do think the risk is probably in the smaller companies who are dealing direct with the clients and the FMs. What was the second question?
What a main contractor, what question could they put to us?
Ask them for evidence of competency.
Yeah.
And don't just look for the CSCS.
And it was specifically related to the behavioural competency.
Well, some of the behaviours will be in the NVQs. There is some, like I said before, what we haven't got is a lot of products at the minute for behaviours. But I would encourage people to start understanding about NVQs, SVQs. Where do NVQs and SVQs come from? They come from National Occupational Standards.
Yep.
What are National Occupational Standards made from? What have they got in? They've got defined skills and knowledge.
Yep.
So the quicker we look at the standards, and the other competency frameworks are coming, that'll be a clash. The quicker we look at the competency frameworks there, ultimately you can do internal behaviours. There's a lot of internal companies doing internal programs of behaviours. You see that a lot in high security places, like a nuclear sector.
Yeah.
You know, that nuclear sector, their behaviours, they're constantly doing, they're constantly monitoring.
Yeah, there's some fantastic points there, and I think what you touched on also as well about actually there being, I think it's section 11I of part 2A that actually says about
Ceasing to be competent.
if you cease to be competent, you know, and I remember I did a post about this on LinkedIn recently, and it got some fantastic response. The amount of people that weren't aware of it. But if a specialist subcontractor ceases to be competent, an example of that might be where a new standard comes out and they're not operating correct. A great example. You know, they cease to be competent. They have a legal obligation to actually notify.
Well, if you look at 11A, that item 6, there's a legal obligation not to accept the job.
Yeah.
And you know, so there's so much hazard out there now, but it's not necessarily in the engineering, it's in the documentation that they shouldn't have signed it off in the first place.
100%.
Correct, that's very interesting. So,
Over to building control for that.
well, I'm just going to move the conversation on here because we've got some. Well, our next point is what are the ongoing gaps in section 4 of this conversation? And one of the questions we've had come in, I think, is a great point. I'm probably going to come to Doug first on this one, but the others can chip in as well. We've heard of companies appointed for Gateway 2 design who have had major structural issues with design and material failures. A, how can this be prevented? And B, assuming this is happening accidentally, what due diligence should principal designers or principal contractors be applying?
Good luck with that, Doug.
Yeah, I mean, short of putting a checker trade system of the previous reviews and getting 5-star, it's a worry. And I think for main contractors, I think they do have a difficult job.
Yeah.
And I think making the assessment and looking at previous projects, now, I know it's not within the building safety regulator's remit to blacklist someone or to have a mark there, but you'd like to think there should be a record of something as serious as a structural failure.
Yeah.
Now, that could be cross-referenced.
Yeah.
Because a structural failure will more than likely have led to legal issues from someone, right? So there should be a record of that. And if that person's set up another company, and a Phoenix company, how do you tell about that person's competence? So I think I don't envy the position of a main contractor. I think if they're doing their due diligence and assessing the behaviours, have these companies got ongoing training? Have they got digital processes? Have they got competency mapping workshops, etc.? Have they got something that proves that they're proving themselves in the right direction?
Yeah. Like a competency matrix or something like that.
It is happening. It is something that we can give examples of.
Yeah,
but we won't.
Sure. Well, it kind of links on with another question that's come in here, which big guy can jump in on this, and it kind of touches on what came into the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 report. So the question is it not time we follow the American model with contractors having to be licensed, which I think was one of the recommendations from the Phase 2 report. James, have you got any thoughts, comments around that? Licensing contractors?
To be honest, that's not probably my field of that one that I can really add any more to it, but I know somebody who can. Over to you, David.
Yes. Ireland are already transitioning to a fully licensed industry.
Yeah.
You know, I love Ireland, but I love England, UK, and I think we've missed a trick. We should have led on transitioning to full license. When I raised this, they said, oh yes, but Ireland's a lot smaller than us. We're more complicated. It's going to be complex to transition to full license. Building a wall in Ireland is the same as building a wall in the UK. Just, okay, so we've got more walls, but doesn't matter. You just roll out the situation. So yeah, we missed a trick. We should go full license. There was a time, you know, pulling on the MOTs and the driving and all this sort of stuff. There was a time, you know, my father, my late father, drove on the roads with before licenses were there. Fortunately, he drove on the left. He could have driven on the right. I've been abroad, I've been in various parts in the Asia and things like that, where they do drive left and right, and you have to weave your way through traffic. You know,
It does happen in the UK as well, David, unfortunately.
Just to be clear, this isn't what's happening in Ireland.
I worked for quite a time in East Africa. I've driven from, before it was a highway, a metalled highway, it was a sand road where you had to put your one wheel down a rut and you drove for 12 hours from Mombasa to Nairobi and hoped to get there before the dark. But you know, we were passing lorries one side, lorries the other side. We were trying to aim down. We didn't want to get out of that rut because it was mayhem. The construction industry is very much like that. You know?
I wasn't going to make that connection, but now you
So what you're saying is, if in doubt, leave it to the Irish.
Follow the rut.
Can I say that? I'm half Irish, so maybe.
We need to go full license. You know, it's really.
I think the only thing I'd say with the licensing, I think what we've got to do as an industry is take ownership of the failure of what we've done. You know, ultimately, what Judith brought to light, you know, is basically we failed this sector. And it was so bad, we changed the laws and we made new ones. So let's not beat around the bush. But what you've got to look at is this industry is a multi, God knows how much money. And there's organisations and people look at this industry as though it's there to serve them. Rather than actually, at some point, if you sit in a certain chair, maybe you should be serving that industry. And so I hear what Steve is saying about the licences, but how many certificates has companies got on the wall that they've been paying for over X amount of years? And it's supposed to, you know, covers me for this, covers me for that. And actually, when you pull the curtain behind, actually, no. So these laws will have tremendous impact. And people will make money on the back of it.
It'll be interesting to see how that implementation plays out in Ireland, because there is an argument to say maybe that could drive a tick box mentality, but also there's arguments to say that, you know, it could drive closer scrutiny on competency.
I'm going to keep using it as an example with the petrochemical and nuclear industry. You know, got pipe fitters there, welders, and all them trades there. There's a successful industry. You know, they've governed and monitored the competence of their workforce. So what did we get wrong? Why did we get it wrong? Why did apprenticeships start failing in the 90s? Why was it easy to walk on a construction site with just be doing a multiple choice question paper?
We do have an elephant in the room, and you know, we're now being told we have to work, well, it's enshrined in the Building Safety Act that we have to work digitally. In a different forum, the Institute of Construction Management are part of an organisation called Future.now. Big data. Big data has looked at more than 52% of all industry is digitally illiterate in two of the essential 20 essential digital skills. You know, what we're talking about in the Building Safety Act is not essential digital skills. We're actually looking at more advanced digital skills, you know, to do building safety case and all that. So it's advanced stuff. Construction industry is languishing at the bottom of the industry. FinTech, you know, which you would expect them, they're dealing with Bitcoin and finance and things like
sure,
that.
yeah.
They would be at the top, but there's still a high level of digitally illiteracy in that. But construction is right at the bottom. You know, if we're going to actually try and understand where the industry needs to be, we have to realise that, you know, the SMEs, the micros, how are we going to get those on board to what we're talking about, this philosophy of going forward, if we can't, if they don't know much about the digital side of working digitally.
Yeah.
A lot of the industry think that working digitally is convert it to a PDF and stick it on a file, you know.
Yeah, but the one, I think, last point with this, I think, is actually the one thing when you talk about failures, Joe, okay, is that not only have we failed the Joe public, or the British public out there from a trust element, but actually there are two sides to this. We have failed ourselves, our industry. So we've obviously, everybody who works within the construction industry, we've had so many colleagues and other people we know throughout every element of it, but we have failed them.
Yeah.
They might not have actually ever been within the construction side of a high-rise building or at Grenfell or wherever, but if that person was, then we thought, oh, they know what they're doing, they're competent or whatever, and it turns out, no, they weren't.
Yeah.
We have failed our own colleagues and friends from within our own industry, not just Joe Public.
It's a failure of governance, leadership.
Yeah,
For 20 years.
Yeah, great.
Can
I
just
think
jump.
I think we're looking back at those failures,
Yeah.
and what we've got to say within the industry, it's positive that we are looking forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is the fact that the Building Safety Act has come in place, and it has set out competency. And even if we've moved the bar, it might not be as perfect as we'd all like, but the bar has moved from 10 years ago.
It has,
And that's, you know, we are moving in the right direction, and it's not all bad. It is,
Yeah,
you know,
agreed.
Correct.
I agree. One of the things, you know, that we've touched on here is that leadership. And within leadership, we have influencers.
Yep.
You know, we've got, and within the influencers, we have empowered, we've allowed, the industry has allowed a number of influencers
This isn't
to
YouTube,
become...
David. This isn't YouTube.
No.
It is actually.
Easy, I suppose.
So that empowerment and influencing, we need to understand, are we being, is the industry, are we as the industry being influenced in the wrong ways? Workarounds is something here, you know, because those influencers are running their own businesses.
Yeah.
You know,
No,
there's quite an
good.
interesting point.
There's some great points there, and as Douglas rightly said, there is, you know, there has been a lot changed, and it is going in the right direction.
Yeah.
There is clearly a lot more to do. You've identified an area there where perhaps some innovation has come in to maybe act as a solution to closing a competency gap, has identified through that another competency gap in the lack of digital skills, for example. So, you know, we have to be quite careful about how we respond to these, because, you know, sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. So yeah, you know, these are all great points. One of the questions that's come in, and I think it relates to this point about the ongoing competency gaps, is about the past documents of the BSI Flex and the 8670 series, as to whether they're being adopted consistently across the supply chain, and is this the correct approach, I guess, is the question. You got comments on that, Joe?
I think I actually thought certainly the 8670, 61, 62, 63 were excellent documents. I must admit, certainly the 8672. The 8672 is the competence of principal contractors, and the 861 is designers and then the management. I think what people have got to realise is that those documents and a lot of British standards, I can't make a judgment on an individual competence.
Yeah.
So even though the principal contractor, the 8672, clearly says to the principal contractor that you must monitor the workforce, you must do a skills analysis on the workforce. You can imagine some of the presentations I do to the principal contractors for that. I just think that the gap between the PASs and now the occupational and the competency frameworks, if I had my way, someone somewhere said, oh, we need a load of competency frameworks. Why? We already had the national occupational standards. They had defined skills and knowledge in. Now what you're going to have got, and you've got competency frameworks getting developed by certain organisations and bodies, and you've already got the national occupational standards there. So at some point they're going to clash.
It's almost like they forgot that the NOSs were actually there.
And that's the point. No one realised that national occupational standards are reviewed every 5 years by the Sector Skills Council. No, so it's not Joe Bloggs that makes them. So we had them there, but I think they were hidden to a lot of people, and they didn't realise that they were there. You know, you can get a national occupational standard for getting your hair cut or making a cocktail, for goodness sake. Building service engineering, we've just reviewed them. They've just been reviewed. So at some point you're going to get competency frameworks going to come up, and you're going to have national occupational standards there, and someone's got to make a judgment which one. I do think there's a lot of progress being made by the principal contractors, but that's been driven by legislative format. I do think the designers in the 867s one, they need a lot more support. We've got to remember what the Building Safety Act clearly says, that the only dispensation for competence is with the installers, so they're allowed to be overseen. There's no dispensation for designers or principal contractors. You have to be competent, and that I think is a bit of an area that they need support with. But yeah, I've always thought that the change will come from the principal contractors, and I've always thought the risk then is to the smaller companies who are dealing direct with clients in cities like this, and the FMs, because they're in a bubble. If you've got 1,000 people on a construction site, you're putting practices and procedures in place. You're constantly monitoring it. If you just deal direct with the client on your business, you probably, well, I know for a fact some of them don't even know the Building Safety Regulators there. Don't even know the Building Safety Act's there. It's like, oh right. So yeah, a lot of changes. There is changes, and I agree with Dougie what he said before. But I do also think it's like a Game of Thrones above our head. There's companies, bodies, all
Sure, yeah. Well, that's a great point you make there, and a lot of what we've spoken about has been, I guess, how the industry can react to the regulation. You mentioned the BSL there. We haven't actually spoken much about the regulator. I don't know, maybe James has got some ideas on this, but firstly, what can the BSR be doing, and as we've been talking about clients as well, to move the needle on competence?
No pressure there then.
No pressure. No, I know. Thank you, Joe. I have thought quite hard on this, and this isn't going to be a time for bashing the BSR, because I think we've all got our own ideas of what the Building Safety Regulator was actually created for, what they're supposed to be doing, and when we all went to the BSR conference, I think it was last year in Birmingham, and we all go, loads and loads of people I spoke to were going thinking, oh yeah, I hope we get this bit of information, I hope we find this out, and and agreed that actually that conference, it was the second one that the BSR had done. It was the BSR did actually miss a golden opportunity for when, I think there was 1,200 people, 1,300 people turned up at that event. Right from when we were all at the very beginning of that auditorium, they missed a gilt-edged opportunity to put up on the big screens what the BSR was there for, what its main role within the industry is. And the clues in the name, all right, regulator, and I think a couple of people have pointed this out earlier on. The regulator is not there to actually do all the work for you. It's not there to just sit there and go, right, well, we're just going to go, we'll do that framework, we'll do that. It's actually out there to regulate and to oversee and to enforce, but actually work with industry organisations, individuals, and say, okay, yeah, this is what we're doing. Right, can we hurry that up, please? Can we do this? Can we do that? There's something called the Regulators Code 2014. Okay, again, that's not widely known that there is this Regulatory Code 2014, and there are 7 key points of there, and it's then drawn into, I think, 3 or 4, probably more than that, bullet points under those 7 main points. One of the key points actually that I think the BSR could actually improve on is its lines of communication. Okay, because if we're talking about leadership, you need those lines of communication from BSR out, but also from the people out that need to use the PASs or all the information that's been put together, need to have lines of communication going back the other way. But there has been no proper lines of communication for people to actively go out and ask questions. You can't just be told, oh yeah, ping an email to the people at Boot or where the HSE are, or doing that on the hope that somebody who's competent will be able to actually pick that email up, delegate where that email's got to go and who's going to answer it and this and that. And ultimately, I think that's where the BSR, if we're actually just going to be really honest, this isn't, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a point of really whacking the BSR over the head. But I think people out there, our industry really needs to understand what the role of the BSR is there for. It's not there to do all the work for you. It's got to rely on the industry and work with those bodies there, putting all the information together. But I think it does need also to be, have a little bit of a theoretical whip to start cracking people over there and say, right, come on, this isn't quick enough, we've got to get things out, we've got to be showing people that we actually have got that leadership quality.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make there. You know, communication is an attribute of leadership, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you know, it's one of the criticisms that has come up a few times about the BSR. They're there to regulate, and rightly so. There's reasons for that. What do we expect them to do? But also, what should they be doing, or what more could they be doing to communicate better to the industry? And you know, this is something I pay quite close attention to, being involved in the marketing area of business myself. I keep an eye on the communications that are coming from these different bodies, and particularly the Building Safety Regulator. Is a bulletin once a month sufficient to update the industry, and a webinar once a month? You know, people can make their judgments on that. But you know, one of the things I'd be quite interested to know is what is their budget line for marketing and communications, for example. If we take in other parallel sectors where you've seen regulatory change happen, take road safety campaigns, for example. How was wearing a seatbelt, drink driving communicated to us? What were the campaigns that we used there? You know, these are getting the message to the audience, particularly when you've got a regulatory role, is absolutely critical. So I think that's a really good example.
I think to add to that, Scott, you mentioned about getting the message out. When we talk about the cultural shift, we're talking about people that are aware and willing in their behaviours. If somebody is not engaging, or they see something as a tick box exercise of compliance, competence and so on, we need to understand, why aren't they engaging? Are they unaware? Are they unwilling? Or are they just overwhelmed? And the messaging that we deliver to help shift them into being aware and willing, ideally with all the behaviours, will look different at those stages. And I think, you mentioned on the marketing point, what we don't have is visibility on data. And I'm not talking about, that quote there, show me the bodies. I'm not talking about quote of terrible things that have happened, because what good will look like is a management system. And what good will look like is engagement in CPD, development of standards. These are the markers that we need to be seeing, and also seeing how companies are interacting with that. And as we get more data, we can refer and say, okay, this is the norm. Oh, everyone else is doing this. And that's part of that messaging of saying, this is now where people are at. Where are you? And driving that awareness and willingness by informing people, empowering people, being able to say, companies that have implemented this are seeing this results, whether that is from lessons learned, data coming back, whether it's delays, costs, whatever it is. Actually, we're moving so far towards this digital BIM, AI, so much tech, fantastic tech that you just mentioned earlier, taking pictures and seeing where errors are. And then we've got this gap at the bottom, and in the middle is all of that data, which would help us if we could just see it, and if we could have that accessibility to help shift those mindsets.
We've seen a similar, when we used to see the drive for health and safety, the way we implemented it was wrong. What do I mean by that? Is we didn't tell people why we were doing it. Unfortunately, our society is built on people suffering. So a lot of times we put health and safety procedures in places because we can measure people suffering, whether it be asbestos, whether it be smoking, so we can measure people suffering. And we say, look, let's change that. So when we had the drive in health and safety, we just had people on site saying, you've got to wear that, you've got to do this, do that, and there was no communication. It was a bit of a stick.
Yeah.
We knew in 1983 that if we made people wear seatbelts, X amount of lives were going to be saved. Why? Because we had the data there and we could measure that. Where the failure is telling people why we're doing what
Correct.
we're doing.
It's the sharing of data,
Yeah.
And, the
and
reason
not
why
having
we're
a
doing
commercial or financial
this- yeah.
part behind it. Oh no, I'm not going to share that with you because that's our information.
Correct.
No, do that. No, we've got to get over and above this idea of no, you can't
Yeah,
see it.
we talk about behaviours. Marketing is a model to communicate messages that change behaviours. That is why it exists, and it is, that's something I think, yes, the regulator could do more of, and certainly the different industry bodies could do a better job
They're not above
at.
the regulator, they're not above the laws, and that's a big thing. For me, the Building Safety Act is certainly part 2 of the building regulations. They're all there now. We can't dance around them. And certainly, I always used to think building regulations was the fabric of the building, the components and the systems within the building. Part 2A has nothing to do with the building. It's all about people and the competence and the levels there.
That's great. Okay. Well, we're coming close to the end here, so I just want to move this on. We've got a couple more points to get through, and then we'll maybe get some closing thoughts and takeaways. The point here is, we touched on it earlier, but it comes back to responsibility, and we've spoken about individuals' competency, and we've spoken about organisational competency. It can be confusing. Where does that responsibility lie, I guess, is the question. Bronnie, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I'm certainly experiencing more questions about this. Should it be the individual? Should it be the organisation? It needs to be both, and they're interdependent. So, an individual working in a company, even if they are competent, without the environment, the support, without being listened to at an organisational level, at a team level, their efforts will go unheard, the outcomes will not get delivered. So you need it both at an individual level and an organisational level. We also have different management systems as well that we can refer to. So there are capability management systems for organisations. There's ISO 115 for competence management systems, and in that you would have definitions at individual level that feeds into team level. Team level feeds into organisational level, and the performance and capability and competencies look different depending on those lenses, right? Because your outcomes and your outputs contribute to the next level, right? So I think they are interdependent, and all of the things that we've touched on today show that we need management systems to be able to, continual improvement, continual professional development, skills analysis, all of this sort of review. That is an ongoing cycle which we see in the ISO systems of plan, do, check, act. And that's the cycle that we need to follow. So I think they are interdependent for those reasons.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, David, you want to?
Yeah, it's fascinating, this organisational. I go back a long time when the Corporate Manslaughter Act came in. There's no individual in corporate manslaughter. That is the organisation killing somebody. But of course, an organisation hasn't got a mind.
No.
So it has guiding mind. And we're coming back to that point there, that the individual and the organisation are so entwined that you have to have competent individuals guiding the organisation, and the organisation will form the wrapper.
So what you're saying is you can't have one without the other.
No, it's symbiotic. And then you see, to get to the individual in the old days of corporate manslaughter was Section 35 of the Health and Safety at Work Act.
The 1984 Act,
So there is it's there in plain sight. What we're talking about. So this question about the separation of individual and organisational competence. It's the framework, but on its own, you can't have a competent organisation. It's got to be comprised and built with competent individuals.
Sure.
In the building regulations, part 2A, 11H is for principal contractors. And what was interesting when I see the competence, it specifically tells the principal contractor that they have to name an individual. Which was significant for me because
that's so we mind.
So as big as the tier 1s are, who's the single person you've nominated, because I asked some of the tier ones. So what I did with some of the smaller companies, I've encouraged them to create, if you like, an internal competence and compliance committee, where one person might chair it, but then it's shared their responsibility. I mean, I agree with Brian there about the, you know, we see the 9001, 14001. There is a difference between company criteria, and I've been in a company where they've had the 9001, 14001, and the ISO 45001 on the wall. And the ISO 45001 is a health and safety. And so someone had done an audit and put a health and safety certificate, and no one in the workforce had a qualification.
No, that's great.
So someone's gone and done an audit on health and safety, the procedures, but actually missed that none of the workforce got a qualification.
No, that's interesting. Okay, well, we're coming very close to the end here. We've got a couple more points to get through. So if we do overrun by 5 minutes, if the landlord just bear with us, or
blame David.
If you need to, don't feel free. So I'll come to you on this one, Doug. I think it's about innovation, because we've spoken a lot about, you know, what's changed so far and the gaps and so on. What role can innovation play in reducing how much we rely on individual competency? And is there any examples that you've seen of this?
I think innovation's got a huge role to play with. I think there's the product and the person, and in a lot of instances the technology is already there, but people need to adopt an innovative mindset. You know, for example, I was on site recently and the main contractors asked for digital torque wrenches to be used on fixes, on bolt fixes.
Sure.
That technology's there. They've taken an innovative mindset to prove competency. But I think in terms of product design, we've got a responsibility to de-skill the installation, to take away the variables and the fragility of the installation, have something that's repeatable, that's consistent, that can be checked. Because we've got a skills shortage. I'm a big advocate for apprenticeships, etc., but we do have a skill shortage in the industry. So innovation can be adjusting that. So for example, the fire breaks that go around our stubs, I think was the example that we touched on before. That can be separate pieces put together that relies on a skilled individual to do that properly and a competent individual to check it. If you CNC cut something, like a stub card with my shameless plug, the stub card is two pieces that are CNC cut to go around that stub. My point on that is that we've taken away the skill of the individual in providing a fire safety product, and it's something that can be easily and visually checked by someone who's taken out the QA.
That's a great example. And you mentioned technology there. One of the examples that just came to mind there, something that we've developed recently. The industry that we're in is obviously around fixings and supports for supporting mechanical and electrical services. A lot of what we're dealing with is common repeatable bracketry. Now, obviously now with the way the regulations are, we're mandated to design these, and that puts a lot of focus on the design element, both from a cost and time and people pressure. And so one of the things we developed recently was actually like a platform that is like a configurator. Dynamics is what we call it. And essentially what typically would have taken somebody 2 hours to design, even though it's using the same repeatable design principles, that's now really being reduced down to about 2 minutes where they can get a full engineering report with the design out the back of it. And it's taking away the dependence on the competency of a designer. It's narrowed it down to the guardrails of the design principles that it can't operate outside of. And it's less competency dependence on an individual, but it also, from a cost and financial point of view, it creates a traceable record, removes time constraints and things like that. So these are both examples of what you've mentioned and that there of where innovation can play a part in this competency question. So there's been some really good points here, and there's much more I think we could talk about on this. And it's very much an ongoing conversation. I think it's fair to say competency isn't something that's ever exactly achieved, but it's a living thing, and it's something that we constantly have to demonstrate. So before we wrap up, I think I'd just like to ask each of the panellists for give us some key takeaways. So James, let's start with you.
How did I know you were going to come to me first? I think it's quite straightforward, and a couple of words that I've actually sort of mentioned throughout this thing, and it's trust, it's leadership, okay, because the leadership element of it with competence, I think if you haven't got that from the very get-go, okay, and if you haven't got it there, then all the rest of the other elements of it from below all the way down through the whole project will just the whole thing will just be a complete mess.
Yeah.
And once you have that leadership within a team, within an individual, within an organisation, and the whole atmosphere around from start to finish is so much better. And so a lot of the other things we've touched on in terms of competency of say the individuals and the organisational side, and actually what is competency, with people having the different ideas of their elements of SCEB. Is it this? Is it that? Is it there? And I think ultimately, I think my biggest thing that I want people to really have a thought about, and my main point is, I think we're now coming up. I think it's the 8th year now, isn't it, from Grenfell, and I think that is where my biggest upset and anger is actually, why are we taking so long now, and we haven't even touched on, from the BSI and other people, we haven't even looked at the idea of organisational competence. Is we need to really actually find better and more leaders to actually go, to hell with this, I want to get this done, I want to really drive this forward, and actually we've got to be doing it now.
Yeah.
That's one of my key takeaways from all of this.
Ronnie?
Yeah, so I think one of my key takeaways is in relation to the points on leadership and culture. What we're talking about here is quality.
Yeah.
And to get repeatable quality, to have quality assurance, risk mitigation, continual improvement and lessons learned, we need management systems. So having those systems and processes in place and working to that and repeating that cycle. So I think one of the other key points is we had an example of what good looked like through the voices of the Grenfell residents.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
They were asking for quality. They were repeatable and asking and continually saying, this is what we deserve, this is the standard that it should be. And they weren't listened to, they were seen as annoying and frustrating, and we need to bear that in mind, that when we are implementing our own systems and processes to control quality, that we may experience the same pushback. But to continue doing that because they were doing the right thing,
Yeah.
and we will be doing the right thing by doing that.
Great. Doug?
I think you briefly touched on it earlier, but we're a huge industry, and it's like a huge boat turning. It's going to take a little while for it to turn, but those movements are being made now. There is positive change. There is more focus on safety, compliance, and competence. And that appetite seems to be growing. We've all got an idea of what good looks like, and we're not happy with where we're at the moment, and that's good. There's not complacency within the industry, certainly in most of it, and with the customers that I'm speaking to. So, I think I'd like to see us move forward with skilling the workforce with apprenticeship schemes, etc., with NVQ schemes. De-skilling the product are all moves in the right direction.
Great. David?
Yeah, my takeaway from this panel, and thank you for being with me and being together, it's about traceability, it's about evidence, but it's about understanding. As an industry, we have to understand what we're doing. We serve a community. But, we're moving forward. I was fortunate last December to be invited to present some ideas, some innovation to the Internet Governance Forum. It was a meeting in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. It's a United Nations initiative. It governs the internet. We're moving away from this present way, which we call Web 2. We've done Web 1, Web 2, and things like that. Web3, people haven't realised this, is on the horizon. We have to, because there's so much data out there that it's swamping Web 2, so they need this whole decentralised basis of understanding. People will understand it probably if I said Bitcoin, but it's not Bitcoin, it's the technology of Bitcoin. You know? So I was fortunate that to present to Riyadh in December. Because I was the builder in the patch of this, the Global Blockchain Association have now thrown me a challenge, thrown the Institute of Construction Management a challenge. They say, well, look, you know, you understand the digital situation and the progression, where we're going, and you have an idea of a journey here. The challenge is, what about having a UK construction industry blockchain? Now that is digital identification to everybody, every actor, every duty holder will have an identity that will have their information on this whole blockchain. The whole thing can then hang together with the governance of it can come together. So it's a bit of work. This is a future vision I'm sharing with you. But I can't do it alone. ICM can't do it alone.
Yeah.
We need to come together. That's
Sounds like some cutting-edge innovation, but we look forward to
positivity.
Yeah.
I want to leave you guys
Yeah,
out there
great.
with a positive message of the future.
Fantastic, great to see these things happening.
Thank you.
Good, Kerry?
Well, that's an interesting one to follow on. I suppose my key takeaway would be a curry after that, and a beer. But just to reflect on and expand on what Doug said, and a bit on what James said as well. So it has been 8 years, but there has been legislative changes. There are frameworks that have changed. The culture is gradually improving. For example, building control have gone through a competency framework. We are now qualified. We're now a professional, highly academic industry, and it's time for the rest to step up to the plate. So we have done a lot of work, and that isn't saying that we don't have a lot left to do, but it's just also acknowledging and being positive that we have done a lot, and we are moving in the right direction. So it's not losing faith and losing face in that, because you know we could get bogged down in thinking, my goodness, it's 8 years and we've barely moved, but actually we have done a lot. And we are showing clear progression on where we are going to move forward. And I think we've got a really great appetite, as Doug said, as individuals and especially duty holders. We need to be more aware of our responsibilities. We need to be more open to researching our own possibilities rather than looking to regulators like the BSR or even other building control bodies and saying, you know, can I have a solution to this? It's like, no, you are the competent individual. You have been doing this for as long as you say you've been doing it. You've got the qualifications, you've got the background to show that you can do this. So step up to the plate, find the information and deliver it yourself, because that's what we ultimately need to be doing. And we need to stop having this hand-holding culture of looking to someone else to authorise us and give us permission to do things. We need to just do it and do it right.
Great to see the positivity there. Good. Last but not least, Joe?
Good one.
I think mine would be more to the audience, I think, of what they can do from this point on. I would encourage anyone who's watching this now to do a skills diagnostic on themselves, do a skills diagnostic on anyone within their company, and also the supply chain. Yes, you might not know what you're looking at, what competence looks like, but seek help, ask. You know, those laws that are there, they do exist, and people will be actually out there today. They will actually be committing a criminal act and they don't even know it. Remember, you can contravene the building regulations by not following the correct procedures. You know, like go back to, you can do the engineering activity, but if you haven't got a license, and look at qualifications, some qualifications like licenses. You know, we need them now. Look, just think driving license. So I'd encourage anyone that's watching this, carry out a skills diagnostic on yourself, what your role is, what your workforce is doing, and your supply chain, because you've got a responsibility to them as well. If you want help, just reach out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Good.
Available Christmas, weekends, bar mitzvahs.
£200 an hour.
Oh, we do it for free.
Oh, fair enough.
Great. Well,
Buy
there's
us a curry.
some fantastic takeaways there, and appreciate that. And thanks to all our esteemed panellists for
Thanks to you, Scott.
the
Well
time
done,
and
well
time
done.
and input
Thank you very
today.
much.
And particularly for those joining online and being a part of this Resi Build discussion. I guess just in summary, I know this is kind of, I guess, some of my own takeaways here as well, but it's clear that while the legislation frameworks are improving, cultural change, consistency, leadership, these are all things that remain challenges within the industry. And competency is more than just compliance. It must become embedded in how we lead, how we train, and how we build. So thanks for everyone for watching and for being a part of this. And to join our next event or watch online on demand, you can visit www.resi.build. Alternatively, you can follow Resi Build on LinkedIn for more panels and roundtable discussions. And all of the panelists on the live stream here today, they're all available on LinkedIn as well if you want to reach out and connect with them. So thanks for everybody's time, and that's it for now. Goodbye, and thanks, and see you next time.